Welcome to A Year in the Bible with Daily Grace. From Eden to eternity, the Bible tells one big story of redemption. My name is Tiffany, and I want to spend a few minutes with you every day walking through the Bible chronologically. Together, we will explore God's sovereign plan as the events of Scripture unfold and point to Jesus. Hey, Year in the Bible family. Welcome back to the podcast. Tiffany here, and today we return to the Gospels of Matthew and Mark. Once again, we will see the importance of our heart's posture and how it overflows into our actions. This lesson will come from the Pharisees, a Gentile woman, and even the disciples. We begin with another interaction between Jesus and the Pharisees. This narrative might have sounded familiar to several other interactions Jesus has already had with them, and that is because they just don't seem to understand Jesus' message. The Pharisees are far more concerned with their outward piety than their inward purity before the Lord. Once again, the Pharisees call out Jesus and his disciples for not ceremonially washing their hands before a meal. As we've mentioned before, during the 400 years between Malachi and Matthew, the Sanhedrin was formed, and over time they continually added to God's law. Ceremonial purity was of utmost importance to these religious men. But in this interaction with them, Jesus calls out their hypocritical practices in both the Matthew and Mark accounts. They focus so much on outward cleanliness that they neglect the heart. Their unwashed hands don't defile them, but their sinful hearts do. Jesus uses an example of how these religious men have clung to legalism and tradition instead of truly following the law. He speaks about the command to honor mother and father, and how children do not care for them in their old age by claiming that their money is korban. Korban was money dedicated to God as an offering. Thus, these people neglect the command to honor mother and father through a legalistic addition to the law. Jesus tells these men they have fulfilled the words of Isaiah in Isaiah 29:13. They worship the Lord in vain, and they teach their human doctrines as commands for the people. The Pharisees are merely blind guides leading the blind into a pit. Jesus desires a heart that is devoted to him, not customs, traditions, or legalism. When our hearts are clean because of obedience to Christ, his commands joyfully overflow from our hearts. Sadly, the Pharisees will continue to struggle with this. After this encounter, Jesus and the disciples travel to the area of Tyre and Sidon. Hopefully, these locations sounded familiar as we talked much about God's judgment on them in the Old Testament. These areas are also under Roman rule at this time and filled with Gentiles. Jesus withdrew to this region for rest from his ministry among the Jews. But his fame had even reached these Gentiles, and a woman came to him seeking healing for her daughter. Jesus' response toward this woman might seem harsh at first glance, but in actuality, Jesus was being obedient to the Father's purpose in sending him. Christ was sent first for the Jew, then for the Gentile. Jesus knew his people would reject him, and he knew salvation would be for the Gentiles as well. But during his earthly ministry, his focus was among his people. He was sent to the lost sheep of Israel. But as we've already seen, Jesus had several encounters with Gentiles, like the Roman centurion, and now this Gentile woman. Jesus says that it isn't right to throw the children's bread to the dogs. In the original language, this was a play on words, as Jesus explains to this woman that it is wrong to give what is for the Jews to the Gentile dogs. But Jesus softens this derogatory term that the Jews used for the Gentiles, and instead uses a term that softens the word to mean an annoying stray to a term that means a beloved pet. In other words, the gospel is first for the Jew, but the Gentile is not an outcast from the family of God and will receive salvation, as we will see when we come to the book of Acts. But this woman is persistent and says that even the dogs get the scraps from the table. She was content to have even the scraps of Jesus' love and goodness. Because of this, Jesus calls her faith great and heals her daughter. In this encounter, Jesus showed this woman and his disciples and all of us that all are welcome at the foot of the cross when we seek Christ. We close today with the account of the feeding of the 4,000. This narrative is quite similar to the feeding of the 5,000. All the people came out to hear Jesus teach in a desolate place, and he desired to feed them. Yet even after experiencing the miracle of feeding the 5,000, the disciples still question how Jesus would feed all the people. They still struggled to understand just who Jesus was. Now, before we give them a hard time, we have to remember that we do the same thing. When we face trials that seem insurmountable, we often wonder if even the Lord can help us in them. We too question his power, love, and goodness, despite his continued faithfulness in our lives. But Jesus continually works in our lives, no matter what doubts we may have. And he continually reveals that he is the Messiah that satisfies our hearts and teaches us how to walk in obedience to the Lord. Thanks for joining me today. I will see you tomorrow, friends. Bye.